So cells have to be able to convert energy, E, from the environment into a chemical form that they can use, and that's going to be ATP. So if it's an animal cell, they have to convert energy from the environment, food that they ingest, that gets broken down, eventually becomes blood sugar or glucose that the cell can then break down to harness the chemical energy in glucose and convert it into ATP that the cell can then use directly. If it's a plant cell, it can harness energy from the environment in the sense of sunlight energy and convert that into sugars like glucose that the plant cell can then break down itself with mitochondria into ATP. Okay? Basic difference is animal cells and animals have to ingest food. That's their source of environmental energy. Plant cells and plants can convert solar energy into ATP. So the two organelles that do this, the power stations of the cells in a way, are the chloroplasts here in green within plant cells and photosynthetic organisms, and then mitochondria in reddish orange, also in plant cells and other photosynthetic organisms, and then also in animal cells. So the chloroplasts, most of the living world actually runs on the energy produced by photosynthesis. So all of the animals and consumers have to eat energy provided and stored within plants, or animals eat other animals that eat plants, right? So if you're a rabbit or a cow, you're going to eat plants. You're an herbivore. But if you're a predatory animal on that rabbit or on that cow, you're going to eat those animals and get energy from them, but the energy in those animals came from the energy harnessed through photosynthesis. So what photosynthesis does, the process of photosynthesis, is it converts sunlight energy into the chemical energy of sugars like glucose, and then plants and other photosynthetic organisms can convert those sugars into the other molecules, organic molecules, meaning into proteins and lipids or fats. So the chloroplasts, these are the organelles unique to plants and algae that are the photosynthetic protists. So algae is the name given to the protists that can photosynthesize. So mitochondria are organelles in eukaryotic cells, I messed that up, that are involved in cellular respiration. So what happens in cellular respiration is that the chemical energy in food molecules, and we will consider just blood sugar, glucose at this point, gets broken down at the mitochondria, and the chemical energy in glucose gets converted and put onto the chemical energy of ATP. So ATP is the direct energy source for cellular work for animal cells and for plant cells. Notice plant cells have mitochondria to break down sugars like glucose and convert it into ATP. But plant cells and photosynthetic cells also have the chloroplasts that harness sunlight energy and convert it into carbohydrates like glucose that gets broken down by the mitochondria. Animal cells do not have chloroplasts, which is why animal cells have to ingest food, eat food. So the mitochondrion chloroplasts, they have their own DNA and ribosomes internally. And that's because the mitochondrion chloroplasts way back in time were consumed by a cell that eventually evolved into a eukaryotic cell. We'll get to that in a minute. But the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, They have a single circular DNA molecule, a chromosome, and it can replicate itself like prokaryotic chromosomes in, say, things like bacteria. So mitochondria and chloroplasts are kind of very interesting and unique organelles. So the theory of how mitochondria and chloroplasts came to be and came to be found in eukaryotic cells excuse me, was that the mitochondria and chloroplasts evolved from ancient free-living prokaryotes, meaning single-celled organisms that lived on their own, and they became established organelles within a host cell that ingested them, probably as a food source, but instead of breaking them down, the precursors to the mitochondria and the ancestral precursors to the chloroplasts were ingested by an ancestral host cell, and the host cell, instead of breaking these down, incorporated them into their cellular organelles, and then the host cell, by doing so, became a early eukaryotic cell, and these ingested precursors to the mitochondria and chloroplasts became actual mitochondria and chloroplasts. Chloroplast if it was a photosynthetic organism, and in doing so was able to incorporate these things, the chloroplasts and the mitochondria, and use them as part of their cellular machinery. And in doing so, the ancient ancestral host, which was prokaryotic, became or was converted into a eukaryotic cell. So the mitochondria and chloroplasts became interdependent with the hosts, and eventually they evolved into a single organism, a single cell, that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts were now inseparable. And this type of relationship is referred to as symbiosis, or a symbiosis is a close association relationship between species, and in this case, between organelles, or previously independent cells, and the host cell. So this theory of how the chloroplasts and the mitochondria developed, is referred to as the endosymbiosis theory that was first proposed by Dr. Lynn Margulis back in the early 70s, 1970s, so not that long ago. And initially, her theory was not widely accepted, but with advances in technology, and especially in being able to examine the DNA of mitochondria and chloroplasts, essentially today the endosymbiotic or endosymbiosis theory is widely accepted in biology. So let's move on to the structural components within a cell called the cytoskeleton. So a network of protein fibers throughout the cytoplasm of a cell, and they function kind of like the way a skeleton functions in your body. Gives you support, helps maintain your shape, and allows for movement. So that those functions are for the cell, and those are functions for the cytoskeleton, so the skeleton of the cell. The fibers are microtubules, intermediate filaments, and microfilaments. You don't need to know like the sizes of these things or what components of the cytoskeleton they are involved with, or like what they do individually within the cells. All I want you to know is that microtubules, intermediate filaments, and microfilaments are the different types of fibers that make up the cytoskeleton within cells. Okay. So maintaining cell shape, the cytoskeleton provides anchorage and reinforcement for many of the organelles, and including the plasma membrane. So the cytoskeleton is a dynamic structure. It can disassemble its fibers and put them together, kind of like Lincoln logs in a way, or like railroad tracks that can be laid down and reassembled and turned to go different directions. So they allow a movement of material within the cells. Remember when we talked about protein synthesis and the pathway for proteins? The protein that gets produced at the rough ER gets transported via a transport vesicle to the Golgi, and then another transport vesicle will deliver those proteins to wherever they're supposed to go. What we didn't talk about when we talked about that was how are the transport vesicles moving? They move because there's components of the cytoskeleton that latch onto the transport vesicles and move them around the cell. The cell shape can change because of the cytoskeleton. So some cells, like white blood cells in your body, can roam around in your cells, in your tissues, and engulf bacteria. So movement of the plasma membrane is done by the cytoskeleton. And if the entire cell is moving, like remember when we talked about the prokaryotic cell with the flagella and it was swimming through the water? What's moving and driving the flagella is components of the cytoskeleton. So anything that's involving movement of within the cell or of the cell itself, think cytoskeleton. So here's a little video of a single-celled organism, something called amoeba, and it's one cell, and it's moving by extending its plasma membrane and moving the cytosol within those extensions of the plasma membrane that are called pseudopods, false feet. And you can see that the material is stringy and moving around. What's moving the material is components of the cytoskeleton. What's moving the plasma membrane, one direction or another one, is components of the plasma membrane components of the cytoskeleton pushing the plasma membrane along or pulling it from the back. Okay, so this is one cell, something called amoeba, but it can move around quite a bit. And again, movement, right? Inside the cell, movement of the cell itself, cytoskeleton. Here's another video of a amoeba engulfing two other protists. Looks like paramecium, and initially it'll play again. Those little single-celled things that are probably paramecium initially don't know they're in trouble until they're engulfed into a food vacuole, and by the time they figure out they're in trouble, it's too late, they cannot escape. And then they'll quickly get destroyed and broken down by a lysosome with digestive enzymes and get converted into nutrients, food for this one cell, the amoeba that's engulfed them. But notice how they're moving around trying to escape. Their movement, cytoskeleton. The amoeba that's moving around to engulf them with these extensions called pseudopodia, movement, cytoskeleton. Okay, so cilia and flagella. Some cells are ciliated and some cells are flagellated. So some cells have these extensions of the plasma membrane. Flagella are long, and usually not that many, 1, 2, or 3. And cilia tend to be pretty short and very numerous, just like maybe the hairs on your arm, okay? So flagella, long extensions, whip-like movement of the cell. And the only flagellated cells in humans are human sperm cells. Cilia, they're much shorter and much more numerous, and they move by, again, action of the cytoskeleton that extend into the cilia, just like the cytoskeleton extends into the flagella. So they allow for relatively smooth movement of the cells. So cilia and flagella allow for movement, especially of protists. And we have cilia in our bodies aligning the respiratory tract, like in your windpipe, your trachea. However, the cells are stationary, but the cilia move, and they move the mucus that lines our respiratory tract to help clear out debris that we inhale. So we'll finish this up in the next part.